Live from the other side of America.
Mama let me sip the 40, I was just a shorty.
Damn.
Then I started spitting garlic, and they said record me.
Man.
I feel like this shit was for me, this my story.
Facts.
Yeah, jump out the porch, I got a Porsche, no take it back. I'm on the block with the killers and holding my own, of course, yeah. I see my mom and dad separate, ain't talking divorce. Said daddy was living by the fire, and he died by the torch. I'm where the AKs is, we like the baby kids. Ain't ever daddy, I listen to suckers the same way that Ray did. I'm talking Smithers and HKs, and I just was a grade A kid. Ain't on no guy, and we grew up with hitters and did everything they said. Point out the block, we spinning that. Running the spot, we getting that. Give us some work, we flipping that. I'm hitting from jet, I ain't hitting back. I need a lawyer, money for commissary, ain't nobody ain't sending that. I'm in my cell, like when I get out, I'm making a movie, no Cinemax. Whoo, yeah. Back home and I'm fresh on bail. Phone chirping, it was next to tail. Block popping, it was extra cell. Big dog, they ain't showing remorse. I was begging just to catch a cell. Same block, we was going to war. I was praying I ain't catch a shell. Hey, oh, we ain't starving for 1,000 nights. Living like we trying to die tonight. Glock 40 sound like dynamite. I was fucking up my car money. Selling soap like it's China White. OG said you fucking a block up. I was mad, I was trying to fight. Nigga, we home. Mommy at work, daddy he dead. Nigga, we home. Stomach growling like an AFG, going to bed, we home. Uzi on me, all my friends are dead, nigga, we home.
Report live from the other side of America.
Pulling live from the other side, same corner where my brothers died. Living like we ain't got care. Told my mama I ain't dying here. 40 on me, I ain't buying beer. Ain't have a wheel, now I'm flying Lear. Bunch of fellas on the jet with me, make a movie like it's current air. Started off in the basement, now it's rooftops in LeBron there. Still fighting over cases, I don't bail, nigga, but it's my year. Summertime, make it cold out. Heater on me like a mind clear. Closet bigger than my old house. Thinking about it, I was fine there. Came in the dirt. Dedicated, I was making it work. Medicated, I was taking them perks. Devastated when my niggas got murked. Educated, had to get to it first. I knew trapping it'd get me in jail. Playing with pistols, it'd give me a hearse. But I ain't give a fuck. Send me to church. Woo. Yeah. They gotta catch me in traffic. I ain't with none of this rashes. I been trying to run from these caskets. All of this pain, but then me, nigga, you don't want none of this action. Go get some money and feed your fam, cause this is a fucking disaster. We ain't starving for 1,000 nights. Living like we trying to die tonight. Glock 40 sound like dynamite. I was fucking up my car money. Selling soap like it's China White. OG said you fucking a block up. I was mad, I was trying to fight.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight in our Fuck the Feds panel brought to you by The Centers. So before we get started, just wanted to let folks know that we're going to be having closed captions provided. And to access those, just click the closed caption button at the bottom of the webinar window. We will also be having 2 incredible interpreters providing American Sign Language interpretation throughout the panel. So big thanks to our interpreters, Leandra and Jen. Now, as I mentioned, this panel is being brought to you by The Centers. We are a new national movement organization led by young, powerful people that is leading our generation to reclaim our resources from the war industry, reinvest in life-giving institutions, and repair collaborative relationships with the earth and people around the world. And I'm a proud member of The Centers. My name is Vanny V. I'm a poet and community organizer, born and raised in the Crib, Miami, Florida, where I throw down with several revolutionary organizations committed to changing the material conditions of our world. Being a part of a collective like The Centers that organizes and mobilizes itself to abolish the military-industrial complex is extremely important to me in my quest to achieve true liberation for all oppressed peoples. Besides the fact that the US military is a huge contributor to climate change, it's also considered the largest climate pollutant in history, emitting a larger carbon footprint than over 100 countries. So besides that glaring fact, if my comrades in Cuba and Venezuela are being starved because of US economic sanctions and trade embargoes, then I know I'm not free. And if my homies in Palestine are losing their homeland because of US-backed Israeli invasion, then I know damn well that I can't be free. We can't all be free. We can't be free until we're all free, period. And That's why I find it extremely important to have an anti-militarist stance. And we know that the imperialist oppression that we see abroad is a manifestation of the violence that state forces enact here at home. Which brings us to the why for this panel. Since 45's occupation of the seat of President of the United States, we have heard cries and accusations of fascism, which are ringing even louder since Trump made big headlines recently when he began heavily invoking Nixon-era inspired law and order frameworks and using his executive authority to send federal agents into states across the country through Operation Legend. So these ops are now working hand in hand with already violent local and state police forces and white supremacist vigilantes, continuing the state's long-loved tradition of brutally suppressing uprisings and protests in the wake of state-sanctioned murders, like those of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Tony McDade, and sadly, way too many others. And I say tradition because we know that this wave of authoritarian fascism to be historically on brand for the United States. In Trump's speech announcing this surge of federal agents, he declared belligerently that we will support law enforcement and that we will not be defunding the police. But we refuse to give in to fear. But we know very well that we gotta sharpen our skills and analysis to be able to protect each other. Now, through this panel, Dissenters hopes to provide a space for organizers on the front lines resisting the feds to share about their efforts and organizations, provide clarity on what's happening on the ground, and to offer insights and best practices to those looking to join our fight. Now, without further ado, I'm gonna introduce the amazing panelists that are gonna be joining us tonight. Starting with Ryan Sorrell with Black Rainbow. Ryan is actually the co-founder of Black Rainbow, and he began organizing in college where he founded a Black radical newspaper called the Black Tribune and supported local efforts for social change in Chicago. In his capacity at Black Rainbow, he leads the political education program, book clubs, and direct action strategy. He recently moved back to Kansas City, Missouri, after spending 6 years in Chicago in order to found the organization in his home city. We also have joining us tonight, Brittany De Barros from About Face, Veterans Against the War. Brittany came to About Face with a diverse mix of business, military, and nonprofit leadership experiences that cemented her deep passion and commitment to intersectional movement building work. She was deployed to Afghanistan for a year in 2012 and has worked on economic and racial liberation issues in various capacities since her return. She's particularly passionate about leveraging her experience as a psychological operations officer to center narrative and behavior change in campaign strategy. She's based in New York City. And we also have with us Ariana Salgado from Organized Communities Against Deportations. Ariana is a queer immigrant who was born in Mexico and arrived to the United States at the age of 6. She began organizing in high school with the West Suburban Action Project Nuestra Voz and the Immigrant Youth Justice League, undocumented-led organizations that sought to create safe spaces for undocumented people and resources for higher education. Ariana currently organizes with Organized Communities Against Deportation, a grassroots org that fights against the criminalization, detention, and deportation of undocumented people. And last but certainly not least, we have Ty Carpenter from Don't Shoot PDX. Ty is board president of Don't Shoot Portland, a Black-led human rights nonprofit that advocates for accountability. Founded in 2016 by her mother, Teresa Rayford, Don't Shoot Portland implements art, education, and civic participation within their programming to create social change. Prior to changing the board of directors at Don't Shoot Portland, Ty founded a publication called Compose Yourself Magazine in 2010. Focused on live music, social justice, art, and culture, Compose Yourself Magazine is an online platform for creatives looking to change the world. Now, again, wanting to thank you all for joining us here tonight. Very hyped to hear all the gems that you're going to be dropping for us. And I just wanted to start us off with asking y'all if there's anything else you'd like to share about your organization, your political work, and how you came to this work. And if you want to go ahead and go first, Ty.
Thank you for the intro and for having me. First of all, Don't Shoot Portland. We do a lot of work in the communities, mostly relating to legal referrals. Right now, we have some class action lawsuits that are in the works, so we're still actively filing injunctions. We're trying to ban tear gas in the city of Portland. We recently filed a federal lawsuit against Chad Wolf and Department of Homeland Security. So I think it's just really important that we implement civic participation and, just knowing your rights and trying to keep people safe.
Thank you for that, Ty. And if Brittany, if you would like to go next and just give us a little bit more information about, your organization and what brings you to this work.
Sure. About Face is what we like to describe as a radical political project and community of post 9/11 military veterans who, through our experiences, realized that we were participating in harm that we didn't believe in and came to do anti-imperialist, anti-racist work and leverage the veteran social capital that exists, whether we like it or not, for in service of the movement, as well as whatever skills can be translated in demilitarized, decolonized ways for the movement. So a little bit about that, and then my story is very similar to many of my comrades in the space, which is that I grew up in a really patriotic household. I wasn't really connected to movement growing up. I grew up in Texas, and was like really conservative growing up, and joined the military to pay for college, and because I believed that we were fighting for freedom and justice and all these things that we're told that we're doing. And then, it became undeniable when I was actually deployed to war that we were doing nothing but harm to Afghan people. And as a person who went there really coming from the place of wanting to help, and thinking that we were protecting people and keeping safe, that was devastating. And then coming back, spent years trying to figure out what to do with that, what to do about it, feeling trapped in my contract. And then was lucky in realizing it was actually because of racial justice struggle and the backlash about Colin Kaepernick. And I watched the way that the military and veterans were leveraged as a bludgeon to suppress, racial justice struggle, and realized, like, how dare I not be speaking as a vet with the credibility that comes for whatever, for being a vet. And I think a lot of folks in About Face come from a similar place of waking up and realizing we have a responsibility to do what we can to make right what we participated in whatever ways we can.
Thank you for that. I love hearing that transformation and perspective that you went through. Ariana, if you would also like to give us a little bit more info about your organization and what brings you to the work.
Yeah, so Organized Communities Against Deportations, or OCAD, we've been around since 2012, 2013. Prior to that, we were a project of a bigger network called Undocumented Illinois, which was a network in Illinois made up of undocumented-led groups all over the state. And soon we realized the importance of centering the fight against criminalization and the fight against just the detention and deportation of our people, right? And so it went from being a small project to taking up actually a lot of the activities that we used to do as Undocumented Illinois to now where we are actually our own organization. And what we do is work alongside people who find themselves in deportation proceedings, right? And so we come in touch with folks at different levels of their cases. Sometimes, we come in touch with folks as they are just being detained, right? So helping them get out of detention. Sometimes we come towards the end of the case, right? And we really try to work with the families and have them lead to what a public campaign will look like and what will work or not work for them, right? To make sure that we have them stay in the country, right? Or get out of detention as soon as possible. Aside from that, locally, we also work local campaigns against criminalization and the collaborations between police and ICE. So locally, what that's looked like is the campaign against the Chicago Gang Database, right? And the campaign to get rid of the carve-outs that currently exist in Chicago's Welcoming City ordinance, which still allows for police and ICE collaboration, particularly against folks who are who have some sort of criminal history or interaction with the police. The way that I came into this work was actually in high school. I was undocumented for I think up until 3 years ago. And I also grew up in the west suburbs in Melrose Park. That's really close to DuPage County, and that's a county that on the regular collaborates with immigration agents that's known for sending people over. So it just became a very clear need for me to get involved in figuring out how we keep our community safe.
Dope. Okay, thank you, Ariana. Ryan, if you would like to give us more info as well regarding your work and your organization.
Sure. Yeah, I don't think I have too much to add. Kind of the way that our organization was founded, we, interestingly enough, started last year, and we were originally a rap group and a collective of musicians, which is pretty funny looking back on it now. But kind of after George Floyd got murdered, that very rapidly transformed the trajectory of our organization, and the moment called for us to just change the direction of what we were doing. And even from the very beginning of our organization, the Black Rainbow, we considered ourselves to be what we called a cultural production agency. And so we saw that as not only being a rap group, but any type of art form, like a collective of individuals and an amorphous organization that can rapidly be able to transform itself depending on what the moment is. And so after George Floyd got murdered, I had already came back to Kansas City because I was living in Chicago at the time. But I came back to Kansas City because of quarantine, and I was staying with my parents. And there was 2,000-3,000 people in the streets out here in Kansas City, which is very unheard of because we're not really known to be a politically radical city. And so it was pretty disorganized generally the first few weekends of protest. Whenever there was thousands of people out there. And so that kind of was an opportunity for us to kind of step into that space and help people get organized. So we started to organize our own direct actions and protests. So I think that's really the foundation of our organization currently is direct actions and protests. We did a protest on the 4th of July Anti-Independence Day rally in front of the oldest building in Kansas City, which is it's called Kelly's, which is a bar now. But it previously was where they sold the slaves out of the basement. And there's actually still shackles in the basement of the building. And so we protested outside of that building. So direct action, I would say, is one of the pillars of our organization. We also do community engagement, which just includes things like we've gone to disinvested or divested neighborhoods and gone to a grocery store and literally just stood at the checkout line and just paid for people's groceries. We might just bring $1,000 with us a day and just pay for people's groceries and things like that, or do community cleanups. And the last portion that we do is political education, consciousness raising, and unlearning. And so there's kind of a coalition of organizations in Kansas City that are all pretty new. And so we kind of are helping lead the curriculum for political education in the Kansas City metropolitan area. So.
Oh, thank you for sharing that. I'm glad that y'all responded to the moment, especially in a city like you mentioned that is not really that activated. So I wanted to ask you all, how has Trump's use of federal agents impacted your work on the ground and what you've been seeing or experiencing on the streets? And if Ryan, if you would like to kick us off with that question.
Sure, yeah. I think, so kind of what my first expectation was when Trump announced and his press secretary announced Operation Legend, which Operation Legend originated I'm not sure if all of our viewers know, but Operation Legend originated in Kansas City. It was a 4-year-old Black child who was murdered. A 4-year-old Black child named Legend Taliaferro was murdered out here in some type of violence that just occurred. And so Trump like utilized that moment to exploit the death of that young child in order to send in federal agents into Kansas City. And so what we've seen is not necessarily an aggression from the federal agents, but we've seen that the Kansas City Police Department kind of has like, now they're becoming more aggressive and more violent in order to say, essentially, like, we don't need the federal agents to tear gas you all. We can tear gas the protesters ourselves. We have this under control. And so that's kind of been the first response that we've seen from the Kansas City Police Department. We've also seen kidnappings, which I'm sure, people from Portland and Chicago, many other cities have seen. Like 4 people in our July 17th protest were kidnapped by the police, weren't allowed access to legal counsel. A few days after our protest, one of our members of Black Rainbow got pulled over on a routine traffic stop and was held for over 12 hours and didn't have access to an attorney. A lot of our people have been threatened with terrorism charges while they were being held in the system, in jail. The clocks were covered up, so there's also this like level of psychological psychic warfare that's being imposed on the people as well. And then kind of what that causes, especially when people are being snatched up off the streets, it causes this level of fear to be instilled into protesters. So that's had an impact on the amount of people that are continuing to come out to protest. And so kind of our response to that, I would say, is that we have new chants of things like who has bail money, and the people respond, I do. Or we'll say KCPD and the people respond, we ain't scared. And so now we're trying to like respond to their militancy. And I think that our response now has boosted our own militancy. And we also have weapons trainings and self-defense programs and things like that. So I think generally we've seen a more aggressive police force and also fear that's being instilled into people.
Thank you for that. That's really dope, the self-defense programs. Ariana, if you would like to give us a little bit of more info on how Operation Legend has impacted your work and what you've been seeing on the ground.
Yeah, and I think for us as folks who like are undocumented and are working with folks who are at risk of deportation, really since the Trump presidency came into office, we've been dealing with like federal agents carrying out operations in our neighborhoods, right? And so we knew that this was going to happen as we were paid close attention to what Trump was saying during his campaign. And our people were also paying close attention, and that fear was already there. And so actually, as Trump went into office, one of the first things that we did was create a series of trainings that we did all around Chicago. We did Know Your Rights, Migra Watching, how to document an immigration or ICE agent interaction, how to make sure that you have a packet ready in case that you are picked up, how to defend yourself, different things like that, right? And we did this like fearing for the worst and also hoping that, it wouldn't happen. But in May of 2018 is actually when we saw our first big operation. It was called Operation Keep Safe. And so what that looked like here in Illinois is DHS agents, so ICE agents, HSI agents, which is like the investigative branch, that's attached to ICE, basically rounded people up in ways that we hadn't really seen in our community since like maybe the 90s. I grew up with my parents who arrived in the 90s in the US telling me stories of, how sometimes they would go to like a super mall and then, there would be no one there because the big raid had just happened, right? And so I grew up with these stories, but it's something that we hadn't really seen until 2018, right? So we saw ICE agents stopping people as they were walking in the streets, both in Chicago and suburbs, asking them for documentation. We saw them carry out home raids, right? Rather violently. They show up with weapons. They don't care who's around. They actually conducted an entire raid during like a children's birthday party, right, with weapons, and didn't care, that young people were present. We saw them go into workplaces and take a bunch of people there. And most concerning, right, they also were doing traffic stops, right, and actually presenting themselves as local police. And so people would stop, right, because ICE agents actually don't have the jurisdiction to go ahead and do this, but they love to confuse people, and so people assume it's the police. And then they stop, and then they start talking to them and, giving them all of this information. And so this really was the kickoff of like when we saw that, the way in which Trump was going to use ICE or federal agents against our community. And so with those trainings, right, one of the things that we did right off the bat is create a rapid response network, both in the city of Chicago and some surrounding suburbs. And so what that looks like, right, is that neighborhoods in the city and some suburbs have come together to get trained on what their rights are, both with the police and immigration and any other federal agent, what to do and what not to do if they see a raid or someone being harassed by the police, right, and all of these things. And so because we started doing those trainings prior to this, right as Trump went into office, this actually came really handy once 2018 hit, right? And we started seeing these big operations because people were already trained to document, and it was super useful, right? And that network was already active. And so people were calling us, letting us know that these things were happening. We were able to support people, who were kidnapped or taken, and all of that resulted in us trying to figure out how to find help for people's individual cases, right? And also we filed a lawsuit against like the actions that the ICE agents took that day, right? And because people were already trained to document, we were able to gather a lot of that documentation, right? And so once again, this is something that we have seen since the Trump presidency started. When we heard about these news, right? I think like the city was very quick to say like, oh, we're not going to work with them, or this isn't ICE, we don't collaborate with ICE and things like that. But we know that that's not true, right? And so actually, maybe about a week after that announcement was given is when we actually saw a surge in calls to our hotline, right? Which is where people call in raids and different things like that, or ICE interactions. Where we started noticing that more and more people were being picked up, in the streets as they were driving or as they were doing different things. And so we're seeing, that the collaboration is happening, that officers are here, that the enforcement is continuing, right? And it's definitely adding fear to our community, as it's been throughout this entire presidency. And at the same time, right, like one of the things that we've been doing is organizing against it, right? How do we keep our own neighborhood safe? How do we respond and things like that?
Thank you for that, Ariana. I'm glad to hear the mutual aid efforts that are going on to respond to this moment. And if Brittany could also answer the question as well, just how Operation Legend has impacted your work and what you've been seeing on the ground.
Sure, thank you. So for us, I think a lot of what has already been said, so I'll just say like yes to a lot of that. And I think that our members have in particular been focused in action support roles and local efforts to translate, for example, whatever military skills they might be able to bring to the table in support of movement and in whatever ways that they can to help keep people safe in whatever ways we can, right? So that looks like folks plugging in and falling in with local, especially like Black, Brown, Indigenous radical leadership as street medics, as you know, like tactical consults, and thinking about like kind of the tactical training that cops, federal agencies, military have, right? Just so that folks have insight into that and information that they can use to then plan counter tactics. And thinking about you know, other things like de-escalation and you know, for example, vets can play a particular role because of the identities that a lot of times they hold in like helping to de-escalate you know, white counter protesters, even police, things like that, right? In ways that like sometimes other folks cannot leverage those identities, right, for that purpose, and trying to figure out ways to do that. The other thing we've been seeing, obviously, I'll speak to the blending of the literal military being mobilized across multiple cities, as in the National Guard, but then also it's more obvious, I think, than ever how much, you know, you have dozens at this point of federal agencies that are essentially trained and equipped like militaries, including this new basically Gestapo, right, that Trump has created. And so I think like it's been clear to us that there are particular constitutional and just like structural barriers to a president leveraging National Guard in places in ways, you know, in whatever way they want. And so I think it's important to understand this program as a way to sidestep those barriers, right? So even when you have local electeds, governors, whatever, deciding, okay, we're not going to call out the National Guard, I think that contributed to the decision to need to create his own force, right, that he could send in to cities that he saw as not cooperating with his, you know, fascist aspirations, or I shouldn't say aspirations, implementations. And then we've also seen a ton of, we've been doing, some folks might have seen our like calls to the National Guard to stand down. There, you know, I think that like we know from our own experiences that these are politicizing moments for folks to realize like, what am I actually doing? What did I actually sign up for? And you know, we want folks to feel that way regardless of what community they're being sent into, whether it's their own community or abroad, right? But the reality is, for a lot of folks, the first time that moment is really smacking them in the face is when they're literally being sent into their own communities, right? So to basically police people and you know, potentially unleash violence against those people. So, but we've also been hearing that there's a lot of unrest within the ranks. You know, there's a lot of people who have been telling us about the conditions around like being forced to go on training rotations with no COVID precautions, all kinds of things. And so I think that that's been telling us on those grounds, the opportunities that exist for us to, you know, think about how do we like continue to organize and like basically do what we can to drain these militaries and agencies of bodies and support. And the more that we can do that, even like a small amount, and lifting up their stories and their narratives can have a huge impact when that's like built on and organized around. So thinking about that, what that looks like in practice as we go.
Thank you for that perspective, Brittany. And if Ty, you could answer this question, just, you know, give us info on how Operation Legend has impacted your work and what you've been seeing on the ground.
Yeah, so mostly besides an escalation of the violence against protesters, you know, we've seen the kidnappings, we've seen people getting gassed and beat and chased down in the streets. There's obvious collusion happening between our Portland Police Bureau and the federal agents. Recently we were, the Oregon State Police were deputized, which has made it much more chaotic. There's also our new DA, our new district attorney, Mike Schmidt, who was just recently elected on a very progressive platform of reform. He said that he wouldn't be prosecuting protesters anymore. And because of that, they are now prosecuting federally. So they're going above him in order to prosecute protesters. So we're just seeing it's really insane right now because they're coming at us with a lot of different tactics. Most recently, we've had a lot of people targeted who are very, very important members of our resistance community, such as our ASL interpreters who are down there every night. Recently, that team, they've been targeted, several members of them. Yeah, it's been a lot. And to deputize means to give power to these officers, and they don't have to answer to county. They're pretty much subject to federal punishment. And it also creates a gray line of abuse of authority, which, we know that was done on purpose. So it's, it's a little, it's, intimidating, but we've been doing a lot of legal webinars. We always do that in our programming, but we've upped it now. And especially since COVID, we've been starting to do more webinars that will help with mutual aid, mental health as well. We just started a program called Safer Space for Black Lives Matter, and that is more trauma-informed practices for people as well. So really, I think it's just important to, to make a focus on community care and being able to be on top of that, because things are moving quite quickly here in Portland, which I feel like everyone kind of knows. We're all like in the spotlight right now. So yeah, I feel like paying close attention to what's going on here is probably going to happen in other cities, especially with the deputizing and going above county in order to perpetuate this violence.
Thank you for that, Ty. I appreciate that focus on community care, because a lot of folks are so wrapped up in the heat of the moment that they're really not thinking of that. So just want to uplift that. And I wanted to ask you all regarding the situation in Chicago, where Lori Lightfoot initially postured against allowing the feds into Chicago. She has since allowed the agents to work alongside the Chicago Police Department to target crime, which we know just means more violent policing of poor Black and brown neighborhoods. So what do these recent developments mean for us in terms of how we organize and build solidarity across communities? And if you want to go ahead and answer that, Ty.
Yeah, I mean, that just goes back to my point of where once the policing became more aggressive, we fought back with resistance and resilience. So if anything, once curfews become, once those start getting implemented, it becomes even more of a priority to have bail funds ready for comrades, to provide jail support when needed and necessary. Just getting involved and trying to also protect those leaders that are on the front line and organizing. They're going to be targeted. And a lot of the police here, they use live streams that our people are shooting so that they know where to go. Like, they're completely clueless. So yeah, I think that's very important. It's just staying together and staying tight to kind of combat these tactics, because community knows best. Like, the people that are doing the work, and you need to uplift and invest in those people so that they can continue to, to demand action.
Thank you for that. I definitely agree. Community is everything. And just want to switch it over to Brian, and just, give us perspective on what you think this solidarity between local police and the federal agents, what that means for us as we organize and build solidarity across communities.
Yeah, I think specifically to Kansas City. And then I think something that people in Chicago and organizers in Chicago can certainly relate to is the narrative challenge that comes with having a pro-police Black mayor. We have a pro-police Black mayor here in Kansas City, and he's pretty well, or previously he was pretty well liked, especially amongst older Black folks here. And so that is kind of part of our challenge that we're dealing with. And when Operation Legend was first announced and being implemented, he actually claimed that he found out about it on Twitter from Trump's press secretary. And then the funny part was a few days later, the Kansas City Star, which is the largest newspaper here, put out an article saying that his office had been in contact with the Department of Justice weeks prior. And he had also asked for more police resources to be brought here to Kansas City. So it was very clear that he lied to the public. And so that's kind of, I think, one of the main challenges that we face. And anytime we've done an action, so for instance, at that same July 17th action that we did at the police headquarters, which was organized by 3 Black-led community organizations and protesting organizations, he tweeted about it and said that white agitators were the ones who were vandalizing things, who were causing problems, and he basically tried to use that type of narrative. And so just in terms of how we approach direct actions now, we kind of look at what's being said in different cities. So since I lived in Chicago for a long time, I follow like the Chicago Police Department's Twitter to see what type of narrative spinning that they're doing to try to create propaganda that they can use to villainize and criminalize protesters. And I know that, or even in Portland, same type of thing. So I pretty much study how they're creating propaganda in other cities so that I can know what to expect here in Kansas City. And now what we do is whenever we do direct actions, we'll wrap our direct actions. We consider it to wrap our direct actions in propaganda in media, and we have an entire media strategy. Something else that we did, we authored an open letter that we got published in the Kansas City Star that called for the immediate removal of the federal agents from our city. And it also called for a 50% reduction or defunding in our Kansas City Police Department because in our city statute, they have to spend 20% of the policing funds or 20% of our city funds on the police. And currently we spend about 40% on the police. And so our call for the next fiscal year is to defund the police by 50%. And when we penned our open letter, we got it signed on by the NAACP, the Urban League, the SCLC. And to us, that was very monumental and historic because a lot of these older, civil rights organizations, legacy organizations are typically pretty moderate and pretty scared of taking such radical stances on things. They don't even like to use the word defunding at all. So for us to get them to sign on to that open letter and to also denounce the mayor was a very pivotal moment for us. So that's kind of some of the strategies that we've been using because we do need to change the narrative around it, but we also need to be able to speak to the older Black population out here as well.
Cool, thank you for that, Ryan. So I wanted to take it over to Ariana and ask the same question. Just, give us your perspective on how these recent developments with the federal agents and local police working in tandem, how that's been, impacting how we organize and build solidarity across communities.
Yeah, I think for us as OCAD, it's been really important to make sure that our members and the people that, keep up with our work know that right now, as it exists, it's really difficult to separate the criminal system from the immigration system. They're basically married, right? And that's important for us, for folks to understand, because then folks are able to get an idea as to what these collaborations look like day to day, right? For us, it became really important for folks to know that, you know, CPD through like fusion centers, the fusion centers here, through the like strategic support centers that have developed around the city. I think there's 21 of them now, right? That's a very key way in which the police collaborates with the FBI and ICE agents, right, to target our communities. And that this looks like our loved ones being pulled over, right, as they're driving, just for literally looking like not a white person, right, and being asked to show their documentation. And really important for us to like really drive the point that the same technology, the same surveillance that is being used to target us in that way is being used to target and go after folks who are now being charged for different things, you know, during protests. Right? So really making sure that folks understand that these connections are just, one, undeniable, and that we actually can't get rid of them is super key for us. And some of the ways that we've been doing that, right, is we've had these Chinga la Migra web series, right? Yeah, it means fuck ICE series. And so these series came after, you know, that announcement, and then it also came after ICE announced that they were going to have their first ICE Academy hosted here in Chicago, where they were going to train civilians, basically anybody that wanted to apply, to learn like the tactics, to learn how ICE function, right, and different things like that. Once again, normalizing the actions of ICE, right, and normalizing and using that narrative of like ICE and the police are really only going after the bad people, right? If you're a good person, you have nothing to worry about. So it was really important for us to carry out these web series, right, for our members, to make sure that we're complicating that and we're challenging that, right? And saying that right now, actually, how we say in Spanish, están agarrando parejo, right? Like they're kind of going after everyone, right? There's really no difference between like the good immigrant, the bad immigrant, the good protester or the bad protester, right? And so, you know, those are some of the things that we've been seeing, and that it was really important for us in building solidarity and in showing up to rallies and supporting, right? Making sure that our members knew and understood that context.
Thank you for your perspective, Ariana. And Brittany, if you can go ahead and answer the question for us, just how you feel that the solidarity between the federal agents and local police has been impacting how you organize and how we build solidarity across communities.
Sure. I mean, you know, on one piece, I think we're very much in the process at the moment, collectively stepping back for a moment, taking a knee for a moment, and assessing the landscape, and assessing what tactics and strategies need to be prioritized, especially as we go into this next 4 months, which we know are undoubtedly going to be filled with, you know, things getting more intense, more chaotic from all sides. I think that the piece that we've been, you know, obviously we're focused on dismantling militarism. We differentiate, without going into it for, you know, in too much depth, we differentiate militarism, which is a, you know, system of political, economic, and social philosophies that prioritizes the use of state violence to further state and, by, you know, subsequent corporate interests. We differentiate that from militancy, right? Which is being willing to leverage, you know, by all means necessary, what we have to do in order to protect community, move tactically and operate and keep our folks safe, as well as militarization, because militarization can be a component of militarism, right? But it is not necessarily. That is like the piece where we think about the literal, like, equipment, operations, things like that, right? That are like, that people would relate to the military. And the reason I bring that up is because when we think about all these federal agencies, especially this new one, this new cobbled together one that Trump has formed, like, when we understand militarism and a system of militarism that way, there's no way for us to see those things as not functionally militaries, right? At different levels of jurisdiction. And that's true all the way down to local police forces. And when I say that, I feel like it's important to root that in often I think one of the functions of white supremacy is ahistoricism, right? And I think it's important to root that analysis in the fact that the military, the US military, was actually the first police force on this land, in that it was what was leveraged to, the US military and militarism was formed in response to indigenous resistance, and was leveraged, right, to, and so many of the tactics that we're seeing from these federal agencies, we understand as like tactics that were tested in the suppression and genocide of indigenous people on this land. That those tactics and things were exported and tested in places like Palestine, the Middle East, North Africa, et cetera. And then those things come back home to roost cyclically, right? And so then we have a pipeline of National Guard members who are also law enforcement agents, right? Because the National Guard, technically, unless you're put on federal or state orders, it's a part-time thing. You're seeing people leaving the military, right, and going to police forces, as well as the transfer of $15 billion worth of military equipment. And those were also federal programs, right, that were established. And the first time, right, the testing of those programs was first used against the Panthers. There was a program of the Department of Justice called the Law Enforcement Assistance Agency in 1968, and the first time that transfer to fund and stand up SWAT. And that was the first kind of like intensification of those, militarized chickens coming back to roost in local police agencies in a very distinct way. And the first instance of it was the California National Guard loaning LAPD a tank to use against the Black Panthers. And so, in that sense, when we look at this situation, when you look at it in that context, it's predictable, right? The tactics become much more predictable. And also we see in our comrades the tendency to want to meet force with force, right? And I want to be clear, like, I am not a pacifist. I think that there are justified uses for violence. I support people's rights to protect themselves, etc. And what I'm speaking from is a place of strategy, right? Where I, for example, I was at an occupation, and I watched how folks in a reactive place saw the federal agencies and cops surrounding them. And the response was to try to beat them at their own tactics, right? To like barricade themselves in, when instead of thinking like, what are the strengths that we have as community, as activists who are rooted together and move in particular ways that we can leverage to meet the vulnerabilities of a clunky, slow-moving, unprincipled, unpassionate, but very violent set of agencies and things like that. So I think it's really important for us to be like watching ourselves in those like reactive moments around not trying to be like, we're going to like try to directly, tactically outmaneuver these folks, and instead thinking about like, what are the strengths that we have that they don't have that we can use to our benefit? And frankly, like, you can read the US Military Guide on Insurgency to get philosophical grounding in how we can leverage those techniques, because, we're never going to win in a tactics, same tactics versus same tactics. So that's, I know that that's a little bit broad, but bringing in that, like, thinking about how we can apply some of these concepts is kind of what comes up for me.
Thank you for that very thorough response, Brittany. I really appreciate that. You mentioning the National Guard, it's no secret, like, as you mentioned, that they've been deployed to assist law enforcement in various states. And as abolitionists and organizers fighting for a world without police and prisons, how do you think we should situate the National Guard and military's relationship to the police and policing?
Yeah, I think it's really, I think that one thing that is really important for us to, like, let's not be in a bubble and like delude ourselves about the reality of what we're dealing with, is that, like, to this day, the US military is the most trusted institution. When you poll the general public, that's still true, right? And like, from a narrative strategy, a visual and tactical strategy perspective, like in many ways, that's the utility of deploying the National Guard as opposed to local police or other federal agencies, is that it evokes particular conditioned reactions from the American public. And even a lot of protesters, right, are like, oh, the National Guard are here to protect us, right? And so like, one of the most important things that when I asked our crew, like, hey, I'm going to be on here, what do you think is really important to lift up? One of the most important things they said is like, the crystallizing thing is that is this assumption or assessment that we can use violence to create safety, that we can use violence to create peace, right? That's the common logic of policing and of the military. And so I think that in our narrative struggle, we have to be real about where the American public is, even a lot of the American left. And when I say that, I mean people living on this land, right? And think about, you know, how do we continue to chip away? Every single narrative we put out has, I think, in my opinion, has to erode and lift up that faulty logic, that we know that that logic is false. All of the evidence is on our side pointing to that evidence being false. And in order to do that, we also need to be more nuanced about calling things what they are, right? That the military is functionally for violence. Because even as COVID happened before the uprising was at the level that it was, like we were seeing people relieved that, you know, oh, the military is going to do public health. And then with the post office, oh, the military is going to deliver the mail. Oh, the military is going to help with the keep the peace, right? And there's this assumption that you can just use the military for anything you need. And that is rooted in the ways that we use euphemisms to talk about what the military is, which is a vehicle that is designed to do brutal violence, period, right? You can put all kinds of job titles and all kinds of marketing around it, but at the end of the day, that's what every troop is trained in, is how to do violence. And that cross applies, right? And so, except, you know, all those euphemisms impact the relationship and how those things show up on the ground in practice. So that's, you know, those two pieces, chipping away at those narratives, I think is really important for unlocking our capacity to get to scale towards that abolitionist vision.
So you've been mentioning, well, thank you very much for your answer. And I just wanted to follow up with your comments on narrative building and propaganda, counter propaganda, and just wanted to give a little bit of context regarding your experience as a psychological operations officer. Just, you know, if you could briefly give us info on what exactly that entailed.
Sure. Yeah, so a lot of people haven't heard about, you don't know what PSYOP is, right? Psychological operations. So psychological operations is psychological warfare, which includes tactical maneuvers meant to have a particular psychological impact to shape behavior, you know, literal media-based propaganda, et cetera. But it's all like, how do we influence people's psychology to influence their behavior? And it's basically getting at all of the things I just said, right? That's how we basically manufactured consent for these violent forces to be keeping our neighborhoods safe, you know? And I think that even though technically the US military's PSYOP is not allowed to operate on, you know, is not allowed to target US citizens populations. That's what it is. That's what the language is. The PSYOP is legally allowed to lie, and does. So there's deception operations happening around the world, intentionally shaping, you know, it connects and usually is a component of tactical and counterinsurgency operations in the Middle East and in North Africa. And it looks all kinds of friendly ways, you know, it often takes the forms of video games, movies, commercials, PR campaigns where soccer balls and things like that are being given out to build goodwill, et cetera. And even though technically US, you know, Army and military PSYOP is not allowed to be used against our target, right, like US citizen populations, in the age of the internet, that's a very vague rule. If we even assume that the military is following those rules, which I think that there's really good arguments to, you know, reasons to question that. And then those same tactics and trainings are used by other agencies, right? There's like a lot of skill sharing that happens between military officials, a revolving door of military people going into federal agencies and into police forces, as we already said, and even international militaries like the Israeli military and things like that. So as well as like defense corporations. So those become tactics that get absorbed and adopted there that we should be thinking about.
Thank you for that insight. So I wanted to go to the next question for you all. Just wanted to ask what insights and strategies and advice you'd like to give folks who are looking to take action in their local areas. Any best practices you've developed when dealing with these militarized forces, and how folks could directly support your efforts. And if Ty, if you could answer this for us, please.
Yeah, thank you. So here in Portland, we've had a lot of organizing happen in a short amount of time. You know, and we still have groups consistently popping up and sort of making names for themselves. Personally, right now, among all the protests, we're having a lot of gun violence in our Black communities. And we've had about, I think it was 17 murders since August. And it's just, it's terrible. And these families that are trying to get justice, a lot of this has been like Black teens. The police bureau is basically saying that they don't have bandwidth because of protests. So a lot of what we've been doing, I know I keep saying community care, but I mean, it's the greatest asset that we have. Recently, there's been groups mobilizing, like a lot of people saw the Wall of Moms, dads with leaf blowers down on the front lines trying to get tear gas away from folks. And, you know, recently we've been working with a group here called Wall of Vets. And, you know, they're actually trying to help residential neighborhoods and these families that are going through harassment and intimidation tactics by not only police forces and these outside agitators, because we also have a huge issue with white supremacy here as well. So, you know, in addition to having to keep up with this, there's a lot of threats to our Black and brown communities. So our defenses are just really high. There's always a place for everyone to get involved, whether that's you being out on the front lines or you trying to organize your networks in order to show up where you can, supporting the groups that are on the ground as well, and really just trying to maintain connection so that you can provide mutual aid. That's another big thing that we do, especially with the wildfires happening right now. We are always looking for assistance with that. We help a lot of unincorporated territories and Indigenous communities. And yeah, the crisis is just spreading right now. So any help with that would be, if people wanted to get involved with Don't Shoot, of course, you know, that would be much appreciated.
Yeah, thank you for that. And, you know, panelists, feel free to drop your plugs in the chat for, you know, the organizations you're working with and how folks could donate or get involved. And I'd just like to switch it over to Ryan, and, you know, if you can give us any insights or strategies or advice on folks looking to take action, and any best practices you've developed.
Yes, thank you again. I think just once again, kind of thinking back to the psychological operations aspect and like the fear, because that's really, I think, in addition to the actual militarization of the police in Kansas City, I think it's like the psychological fear that's being instilled into our people. And to me, one of the most important things that we've been practicing is very big jail support actions, just because we're expecting people to get arrested, even if it's not at a protest, because there's been numerous people who have been arrested supposedly for traffic stops, and then they get held for very long periods of time. And so jail support has been incredibly important for us in terms of morale of our people. I think also having a strong legal support team has been extremely important for us, just because I think when people, especially people in our different organizations out here, if they know that we have a really good legal team, then it, you know, gives people confidence to continue to go back out into the streets and to not be afraid of getting arrested or whatever the police decide to try to do to us that day. And then I think the last thing is practicing, I think someone else mentioned it earlier, but practicing harm reduction, practicing transformative justice and like internally, because I think, one of the things that we frequently talk about is like abolition externally and how we want to see the world, and something that, since we're such a nascent city in terms of our political consciousness, we've had to continually reflect internally on like, how are we every single day practicing transformative justice. And when we're all bringing all of these different traumas that we've experienced in our lives and are continuing to experience because of the state and state violence, we're coming back into our meetings and we have all this trauma, and people at some point are going to get pissed off at each other, and like there's going to be conflicts, all different types of things that can happen internally in an organization. So I think having internal structures to be able to deal with trauma in an effective way and to heal has been incredibly important for us. And we're still in the early stages. We actually have consultants that I'm actually meeting with right after I leave this call. We had to reach out to 2 consultants out here because we didn't have the internal capacity to be able to teach each other about transformative justice in the way that we needed to. And we had a lot of internal challenges coming up. And so we had to reach out to 2 consultants in the area who are just really dope at like transformative justice, healing, harm reduction, all types of stuff like that. And so they've been helping us work through the internal challenges, helping us establish the foundation of our organization, help us establish what our mission and vision, because of the fact that our organization was founded so quickly. And I think Ty mentioned how there's like groups popping up all the time. Because we were founded as like a direct action mobilization organization, that's pretty much like what we were doing. And we didn't have time to like focus on what is our mission, what is our vision, what are our community agreements. We didn't have time to think about those things. So now, like 3 months down the line, after it's a little bit too late, but we still have time to do it. That's what our consultants are helping us with right now. So I think that's, if you're starting an organization or if you're in an organization, if to people who are new to it, I would definitely recommend making those things a priority, so that you don't get too far down the line and have to like try to create a foundation for your organization before it's too late.
Thank you for that. I also wanted to ask a little bit of info about the self-defense trainings that you mentioned, whatever you briefly feel comfortable sharing about that.
Sure, yeah, so we're still getting connected to the Socialist Rifle Association out here, who are going to be giving us weapons trainings for free. And then we've also been doing weekly self-defense trainings from an MMA guy out here and we have former military people as well who have been teaching us just like different types of submission things and like striking and also de-arming, because at one of our protests last weekend, actually, there were some white supremacists who brought long guns to our protests, and one of our former military people had to de-arm him. So those are just some of the things that we're working on, but we're still in pretty early stages of that too.
Glad to hear that it became useful at a point though. Thank you for that. And I just wanted to switch it over to Ariana and just, ask you what insights and strategies or advice you'd like to give folks on the call regarding taking action in their local areas, and what best practices you've developed when dealing with these militarized forces.
Yeah, I think that for us, we've really encouraged folks to look around and do some research, and see if there is a rapid response that exists in your neighborhood, especially if you're living in Chicago. Because once again, we seek to just make sure that everyone in the community knows information on their rights, on how to document, on how to keep each other safe if those encounters do happen. And we want to make sure that everyone's armed with those tools, right? Not only when we show up to protest, but also, once again, as we've seen a recent increase in ICE activity in our neighborhood. So, if you're from Chicago and you live in Logan Square, Albany Park, Little Village, Back of the Yards, just to name a few. These are some neighborhoods that already have their rapid response teams that are functioning right and up and running, and that it's super, easy for you to plug in if you're trying to figure out, what do I do locally, right? What do I do in my own neighborhood to keep me and my neighbors safe against ICE? In terms of like what's been really helpful, is actually just making sure that people know their rights, right? Once again, for us, ICE agents very often lie and say that they're represent an agency that they're not, right? And so for us, it's been really important to make sure that people know and, know that they have some rights, right, and some power that can really help them in that situation. So for example, asking like, who am I interacting with, and that really defines what type of information you should give them, right? Or but generally we recommend that you remain silent, right? So like making sure that we know that our people know their rights and our people know what to do with those interactions is super important. And yeah, I think like in terms of like defense from the day-to-day home rates and workplace rates that we see, is definitely having the neighborhoods know who to call and what to do. If ICE is in the neighborhood, I think has been like a really good way that we keep each other safe and that we know when these things happen, so we know how to best support each other.
Thank you for that perspective, Ariana. I also wanted to ask if you wanted to plug folks in on how to support your work.
Yes, I'm gonna type on the chat our website, and you can visit our website. If you have any questions on how to connect with your local group, on how to connect with us, you can definitely shoot us a message through there, and you can learn a little bit more about our other campaigns that are still ongoing and some of our members' cases as well.
Thank you so much, Ariana. And we're gonna switch it over to Brittany with the. Oh, sorry, muted myself. With the same question, what insights or strategies you'd like to give folks looking to take action, and what best practices you've developed, and how folks can support your efforts.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I would say that most vets who are at least on the precipice of becoming anti-imperialist or already are want nothing to do with other vets, because we want nothing to do with like the toxic vet bro culture that exists in most veteran organizations. So I would say, but I think that there are particular things about the way that we've been harmed and conditioned in the military itself, not even what we've done, right? But the way that we were brainwashed and conditioned, that take a lot of undoing internally in order to be well. And like what Ryan was speaking to about the ways that that trauma plays out in movement were like super resonating. So I would just say, in terms of what people can do and supporting us, if you are a vet or if there are vets in your base, encourage them to like talk to or connect with About Face and see if we might be a good, second or first political home in terms of like continuing to demilitarize and heal ourselves so that we can be useful in, and well enough to actually be in service of movement in a way that is not replicating that harm. And I think that that's especially important as we're seeing, like, vets are going to be used as political props regardless. We're already seeing that, right? For both sides. So it's important that we be organizing to have our own voice and be putting forward the narrative we need. The other thing I would say in terms of tactics is I think folks, the pieces that folks have already said, I agree with, particularly around like, how do we address harm with each other? And that relates, I think, in addition to that, I think folks need to be studying the repression tactics that happened in the 60s and 70s. And even for them, but especially then, because you'll see on the PSYOP note that the most effective movement repression tactics are not necessarily the direct attacks on key movement leaders so much as they are instigating internal infighting, right, in ways that destroy the movement and destroy our unity and progress. And I think we need to be studying that and getting tight together. The repression is only going to get worse, especially if Trump is reelected. We should see this Operation Legend as him testing the waters think about it, he's right now up for re-election. Imagine what he will do when he doesn't even have to worry about being up for re-election, right? And so I just think we need to be real about like the ways that we need to get tight together in our assessment, our analysis, and our practices and principles now. Or that's going to be the more destructive force than the literal like legal and violent repression. And then the last thing I would say that goes with that is just, I think that we are in a revolutionary moment, and I think that we need to act accordingly, and we need to be thinking about like, how do we get it? We as leftists mostly have seen the grotesque harms of violent types of hierarchy, right? And authoritarianism, et cetera, and are like committed to that, and yet go so far in our opposition to that, that sometimes we then become a leftist version of individualistic, where it's like, well, I'm gonna individually decide to not participate with this system, because I feel better about myself, even though the material impact of that is that we just cede ground, right? And we miss an opportunity to actually get information collectively and make collective strategic moves to scale that can set up us to be in better conditions, to be building towards the long-term power that we actually need. And I think in the moment that we're going to, we're not facing a vote that is establishment versus establishment. We're facing a vote that is neoliberal establishment versus rogue, authoritarian and fascist. And I think we need to be real about and nuanced about that analysis. And we need to be having conversations in our communities about what makes sense and looking for left formations that can help us get together and leverage our power to scale in the United States in a way that is rare in the United States, but has been very effective in many other lands and countries.
Thank you, Brittany. So yeah, definitely bars. Wanted to ask you all, what just some final thoughts on, the political moment that we're in, and any points that you feel is important to discuss together. Ty, if you could start us off.
Yeah, thank you. You said just final words. I'm sorry, will you repeat it?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, just final words on the political moment that we're in, and any key points you think it would be important to discuss or that folks should take away from the call.
Definitely. There's been just a wealth of information given by everyone on this panel, so I'm happy to be a part of it because I learned a lot. And also, I wanted to mention it's so important right now to keep notice of what your lawmakers are saying, how elected officials are responding. People that are up for re-election, look into that as well. I think it's important also the community organizations, the institutions that are in your communities, are they doing the work or are they complicit? And begin to call that out, begin to call for a divestment of these institutions that are actually harming our communities, because they're huge partners in community policing as well. And community policing is what started all of this. So there's no better time than now, I feel, to hold institutions accountable, especially the older institutions that no one's really questioned, yet they've been maybe silent or maybe indifferent, or making appearances with elected officials who are actually, not there for the right reasons. I feel like in particular Portland, since we've had so much media that's been skewed quite a bit, and we've got our city council who have been, using this violence in the beginning, and suddenly they're on CNN getting to be like, oh no, like we went down and we got tear gas. It was really bad. This is horrible. Yet those are the same people who are literally our police commissioners, and they're literally the same people who are making this violence worse. So yeah, I would just say for everyone to stay alert and stay informed and keep your leaders accountable right now through what's happening, so you can have sustained real change.
Thank you for that, Ty. If any of our other panelists would like to share some final thoughts, regarding the political moment that we're in, and just anything that they feel like the audience should take with them.
I think I would just echo Ty in terms of uh, this current crisis and like the moment that we're in. And I was listening to Dr. Robin D.G. Kelley, who called this the third Reconstruction. Also, how Brittany was talking about in terms of this really being the moment. It's like, are we going to go into full-blown fascism? This is the moment right now that's going to determine whether we're going to go into full-blown, like, militarized, authoritarian, possibly dictatorship fascism. And so I think that we absolutely just have to continue to like give everything that we have in this moment. If we don't want that world, if we don't want that to be the future reality that we and our children are living in. So I would want to echo that. And then also, once again, echoing Brittany, who had lots of dope insights tonight in terms of just the importance of the analysis aspect. For instance, Legend Taliaferro, who was the 4-year-old that Operation Legend was named after, as I mentioned earlier, his mother was in full alignment with Operation Legend, and what that kind of, and I reached out to her and I've spoken with her, and kind of what that signaled to me and just like materialized to me is like the importance of building that analysis not only within our organizations but within our communities. And like there's no way I'm going to go to someone whose 4-year-old son was just murdered and like try to explain abolition and like non-carceral justice and transformative justice. Like these are things that we have to continually be doing before those types of crises happen. So like that's really like one of the bigger challenges to me is like being able to support her and other Black people who deal with interpersonal harm and interpersonal violence, while also being able to educate our community and build with our community and through the abolitionist framework. So that's kind of some of the challenges that I see, but I think that something else that Robin D.G. Kelley mentioned about this moment is he said it was a portal. And that portals don't come along very often, and that this is a portal because it's kind of like sped up the consciousness and the ability to raise the consciousness of people. And I can remember like last year, if we mentioned abolition, like that was like the most radical, only people in like left radical circles would ever talk about that idea. And I previously, like last year, I was working in a corporate white job, and in March, before I quit that job, the president of the company, who's like this middle-aged white guy, was like, "Hey, Ryan, can you talk to me about abolition?" And literally like that was like the craziest moment for me. And like being able to see how abolition has become a mainstream concept now. And I think that that's something that we really have to seize the moment for. So.
Appreciate that. And yeah, I definitely agree. Even out here in Miami, you know, abolition was something that most people didn't even know what it was. And now it's like, you know, a lot of people are just clamoring, you know, defund the police, defund the police. So yeah, thank you for that insight. And very interesting, you know, Robin D.G. Kelley calling it the third Reconstruction. That's really dope analysis. So I wanted to thank you all for joining us tonight. And I see we have a couple minutes left. So I just wanted to ask a question that I had in mind for Ty. Just wanted to see if you can give us a little bit more info about the magazine that you have, the online platform for creatives, Compose Yourself magazine.
Yeah, definitely. So I've had it it's been almost 10 years, and it started out as a way to combine live music and youth culture and art. I've always been a writer by nature, and as well as, you know, working freelance for a lot of other companies and businesses, I got sick of feeling like I couldn't really express myself and say the radical shit that I wanted to say. So I wanted to create my own outlet. And, you know, a lot of this, it's not, you know, it's common sense. It's like, if you're into like live music and art, and if you're a creative, you just have more of an incentive more of an urge to want to help people, to want to help build your communities. And I felt like there had to be a way to bridge sort of the gap between like live music lovers and people that are, you know, maybe looking for inspiration and being able to like share what they want to do. And it's like a global network, you know, of people doing things and making movements in their own communities, and we're able to like spotlight it. And yeah, I think it's important. What's going on right now, I've been more involved with Don't Shoot, but we try to use CYM as a way to have people connect, and also with musicians and people that have a big platform that we can kind of push through that.
Thank you for that extra info, Ty. If you want to like, you know, drop a plug into the chat for the magazine, and Brittany, if you'd like to share some final thoughts with us.
Yeah, sure. Just the stuff that Ryan was saying made me realize that I wanted to make one last point, which is that I've been thinking a lot about revolution and about how much the left throws around the language of revolution so casually, that in a way that is not rooted in like a really practical assessment and strategy, right? Of like how, not just how do we bring about revolutionary conditions, but also how do we prepare ourselves to win in those conditions? And if we acknowledge that we're in a revolutionary moment, as revolutionaries, we have a duty to not just be stuck in this place of working against the realities of the violence and repression that we're facing, but thinking about how do we maneuver to, you know, strategically to position ourselves to be able to proactively build both the types of like mini models of governance, of navigating harm, right? Of all of these things that we would imagine in a post-revolutionary reality, in the micro sense, in our organizations, in our alliances, but then also fighting to build those in larger and larger ways. And that also, that requires us, right, to be rooted in like sitting down and saying like, how does revolution really happen? And as a person who has been in a war zone, it's just frustrating, I think, how many people living on this land have a type of imperial privilege that we don't always realize. Where we think that what we have right now is like so solid, right? That it couldn't really get that much worse. And when we talk about fascism, all you have to do is look at all of the nations that the United States has helped to unseat the governments, right? To support coup attempts, to, you know, Venezuela, Cuba, all these places, right? Like all you have to do is look at all of those places and see what happens when a government is deposed and there's no unified plan and buy-in around what comes next, right? What you end up with is a failed state and a military dictatorship. And if it's an empire, what you end up with is international, global power vacuums that create the conditions for a world war, right? So when we talk about, there's a lot of folks out here that are like, actually, more fascism would be good because it'll accelerate the collapse of the empire. And that shit, I'm sorry, excuse my language, like fuck that. Because what you're saying is like, you want this civil war, revolutionary war to pop off as soon as possible. But that means that like all the marginalized communities, not just in the United States, but around the world are getting thrown under the bus toward that end in the short run. And in the long run, what you're talking about is a scale of violence that I guarantee you people saying that have never actually seen with their own eyes. You cannot explain the brutality of full-blown war unless you have experience. I can't put it into words. And so we just need to be real about that, right? Because if a war revolutionary scenario pops off soon, the left gets crushed. We get wiped off the face of the fucking earth because we don't have supply lines. We don't have the international connections to support. We don't have a governance plan or the alignment to create a governance plan. And we for damn sure don't have the numbers and military training to be able to actually win in that scenario. So we need to be thinking deeply about what it takes for us to actually set ourselves up. Those of us who believe, I think, that the kind of change that we're looking for is revolutionary, not reformist. So I just wanted to end on that note, since we're talking about, you know, the vision and how we move tactically every day toward that vision.
I really, really appreciate that ending point, Brittany. I really think it's important for folks to realize that revolution is romanticized a lot in the eyes of folks who say that they want it now, but, you know, we don't really realize that we're really not ready yet. We really aren't ready for the type of gore, quite frankly, that we're calling for. So thank you very much for that. I, again, just wanted to thank all of the audience for tuning in. We really appreciate, y'all sticking through with us till the end. We really hope that y'all were able to take some great gems from this panel. I personally did. And I just wanted to plug in, the opportunity for folks to donate if you are willing and able to the centers. We depend on grassroots donations from people like you to make all of our programming free and accessible to young folks. And thank you to everyone who's already chipped in. But we still haven't raised enough to cover the cost of this call quite yet. So if you can afford it, please, non-youth folks especially that join us today, please donate what you can to the centers. Whatever you are able to give would be appreciated, whether it's like $1 or $5, $15, whatever you're able, we really would appreciate it. I'm gonna go ahead and just drop our website into the chat so that y'all can visit and get to know the centers a little bit more. And if you're able, give us a donation, we'd really, really appreciate that. And I just want to thank, our panelists for, gifting us with all of this knowledge and insight. I also wanted to thank our American Sign Language interpreters, Leandra and Jen. Really appreciate, the effort that y'all have put in, as well as our closed captioning interpreters or transcribers who were on the call as well. And I just want to close us off with a quote from a revolutionary fallen comrade, George Jackson, a Black American author, organizer, and political prisoner who was murdered by prison guards in his righteous attempt to escape. So he very famously said, "Settle your quarrels, come together, understand the reality of our situation, understand that fascism is already here, that people are already dying who could be saved, that generations more will live poor, butchered half lives if you fail to act. Do what must be done. Discover your humanity and your love in revolution." I really hope those words resonate for you all and, fill in you passion and fervor to do what needs to be done to create the conditions that we need to be able to have the world that we deserve. So again, I wanted to thank everyone for tuning in, and I hope you all have a very good night.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.